Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something that's like really just fundamental to how we think and how we talk, right? It's metaphor.
Metaphor.
Yeah. And I mean, you run into it everywhere. Shakespeare, Juliet is the sun.
Right.
Or Joyce, history is a nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
Or Benjamin,
Yeah.
a work is a death mask. Obviously, these aren't literal statements, right? But there's something going on under the surface there that's really interesting. And we've got a great stack of stuff here. Like, we've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on metaphor to kind of guide us as we take this deep dive into what's actually happening there.
Okay, well, let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
Right at its core, a metaphor is bringing two different subject matters together. There's what we call the tenor. That's the main thing we're talking about. So your examples, Juliet, history, the work.
Right.
And then there's the vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the lens through which we understand the tenor. So the sun, a nightmare, a death mask.
Right.
And so it's that simultaneous engagement with two distinct areas.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what gives metaphors power.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it is this way of kind of like likening or comparing, drawing an analogy. But here's where it gets really interesting. Especially, from a philosophical perspective, it's that metaphors often connect things that are fundamentally unlike. Right.
Yeah.
So, when we call someone a gorilla, we don't actually think they're like swinging from trees.
Right.
But there's this kind of like accepted pretense or like this shared understanding that there are certain gorilla-like characteristics,
Exactly.
that we're picking up on. And it's important too, as thinkers, to distinguish metaphor from these other ways that we create likeness.
Yeah.
So, simile uses an explicit comparison.
Right.
Like, or as, like Wilbur Queen Anne's lace slang, like lilies on water. Or Chandler as inconspicuous as a tarantula on a slice of angel food. But then you also have these more subtle forms of connection, like Ezra Pound's in a station of the metro.
Right.
The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. So you're not getting a direct comparison there, but there's still this sense of likeness that's being created just through the juxtaposition.
That's right.
So with metaphor, what really sets it apart, I think, is this act of speaking about the tenor. As and in terms of the vehicle.
Right.
So it's not just saying that Julia is like the sun. It's this bold declaration that Juliet be as the sun.
Right.
And there's this double aboutness, as some theorists call it, where you're both talking about Juliet.
Yeah.
And evoking these qualities of the sun at the same time.
Absolutely. And that layering of meaning can actually become really complex. Like take Benjamin's, a work is a death mask of its conception.
Right.
So not only is the work likened to a death mask suggesting, maybe stillness, finality, but the phrase of its conception implies that the initial idea was once alive.
Right.
So you as the listener are actively involved in drawing out these implicit connections.
Yeah.
And understanding this underlying analogy between a life cycle and the creative process.
And the directness of the comparison can vary too, right?
Yeah.
So we have these explicit metaphors that are clear as day. I'm a moth and you are a flame.
Right.
Versus these more implicit ones that are kind of woven into the fabric of the language.
Yeah.
Like Ahab's speech. Talk about his fixed purpose laid with iron rails.
Oh, yeah.
So he's comparing this resolve to this unyielding force, but never actually comes out and says, my purpose is like a train.
Exactly. And within a given metaphor, we can identify the focus, the part that gets reinterpreted figuratively.
Right.
And the frame, which is that surrounding literal language.
Okay.
So like Cole Porter's line, if, baby, I'm the bottom, you're the top. Bottom and top are the focus.
Huh.
They're taking on a relational figurative meaning within the literal context of the sentence.
Right.
Or think of Yeats, where he says, an old man is a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick.
Yeah.
And so here, that entire phrase is the focus. We're invited to read it figuratively.
And this brings up this really fundamental philosophical question. How do we even recognize this shift from literal to metaphorical language?
Right.
How does this interplay between the focus and the frame actually generate meaning?
Yeah.
It seems like there's this division of linguistic labor happening there.
Absolutely. And you see metaphors operating at different scales, too.
Yeah.
And you have extended metaphors.
Right.
That can unfold across, an entire poem or an argument.
Right.
You have contracted metaphors that are packed into a single word or a phrase.
Yeah.
And then there's that phenomenon of mixed metaphors. So Wittgenstein's line, philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of our language. So that kind of clash of battle and bewitchment can create a surprising insight.
Right.
even if it's not strictly coherent.
Right, and it's not just declarative statements either.
Yeah.
We find metaphors in questions, commands, all sorts of linguistic structures.
That's it.
Although, as our source points out, much of modern metaphor theory tends to just focus on the declarative sentence
Right.
as its object of study. Now let's kind of take a step back for a second
Okay.
and consider how thinkers historically, particularly in the ancient world, how did they approach this concept?
So what's fascinating is that ancient philosophers and rhetoricians, people like Aristotle, they largely saw metaphor as this very localized event.
Yeah.
It's this temporary shift in how we use a single term, usually a noun. So a word with its usual meaning gets transferred, just temporarily, to refer to something else that's suitably related, and it's serving this very specific expressive purpose.
So for Aristotle, it wasn't so much that the entire sentence was undergoing a transformation. It was more about an individual word taking on this new temporary reference.
Precisely. Now, he did acknowledge that there were different types of metaphors,
Right.
but he thought the ones that were based on analogy, a perceived likeness between two things.
Yeah.
Those were the most intellectually stimulating. And later thinkers like Quintilian and Cicero really amplify that focus on analogy as the core mechanism of metaphorical transfer.
And did Aristotle kind of see understanding these analogy-based metaphors almost like a cognitive puzzle that you had to solve?
Yeah, exactly.
So he gave that example of Empedocles using old age to refer to the course of a single day.
Right, because old age doesn't literally apply to a day. We have to do that work as interpreters
Yeah.
to identify the underlying analogy. And it's like, well, just as old age is the final stage of a life, evening is the final stage of a day.
Right.
So old age is being used to mean evening.
Okay.
But the value there isn't just decoding what word has been substituted.
Right.
It's recognizing and exploring these deeper parallels between the life cycle and the daily cycle.
Right.
It's a prompt for analogical reasoning.
It's almost like the metaphor is unlocking this whole network of associated ideas through this analogical link. Whereas, as our source highlights contemporary thought, tends to see metaphor as something more fundamentally complex.
Right.
It can't always be so neatly translated into a simple literal statement without some kind of loss.
Yeah, that's a crucial evolution in our understanding.
Yeah.
And it brings us to the idea of paraphrase.
Right.
Because we often try to explain what a metaphor really means in more direct language. So Cavell offered a paraphrase of Juliet is the sun. He was suggesting that Romeo means, Juliet is the warmth of his world, his day begins with her, and so on. And he argued that if we can't offer some kind of explication, we probably haven't really grasped the metaphor.
Right. But then you have that really strong counter-argument, the heresy of paraphrase, as Cleanth Brooks called it, which suggests that something essential, often like the poetic power itself, is lost when we try to reduce a metaphor or a poem to plain prose.
Yeah.
And Empson talked about the pregnancy of metaphors, this richness of meaning that resists any single definitive explanation.
That tension is really at the heart of a lot of the debate. While paraphrase can help us understand certain facets of a metaphor, it often feels inadequate to really capture the full impact and the range of associations that are evoked. It's like trying to describe a musical chord just by listing the individual notes.
So by the mid-20th century, there was this huge resurgence of interest in metaphor theory.
Yeah.
And that led to the emergence of these distinct schools of thought, right?
Yeah.
And our source points to four main traditions that really shaped the conversation.
Absolutely. So 4 key approaches arose: semantic twist accounts, pragmatic twist accounts, comparativist accounts, and brute force accounts. And each of them offers a fundamentally different way of understanding how metaphor creates and conveys meaning.
All right, well, let's start with the first one.
Okay.
Semantic twist accounts. What is the central idea here for those of us who are just trying to wrap our heads around this?
So, semantic twist accounts propose that within a metaphorical utterance, certain words or phrases, the focus, they undergo a temporary shift in their meaning. So they don't retain their usual literal sense, but they acquire a new metaphorical meaning. And that metaphorical meaning is influenced by the literal meanings of the surrounding words, the frame. So the key idea is that there's this kind of friction between the original literal meaning and this newly emergent metaphorical meaning. And our understanding of the metaphor involves resolving this tension by assigning this fresh sense to the focal expressions.
So it's almost like the words themselves are taking on a different meaning, almost like a temporary second definition within the specific context of the metaphor.
Precisely. And thinkers like I.A. Richards and Max Black were really influential in developing these ideas. And later on, Harold Skulski elaborated on this by suggesting that figurative speech involves a kind of temporary linguistic code switching, a move into what he called metaphors, this improvised dialect where words and sentence structures have these temporary non-standard meanings. And the listener then has the task of deciphering this on-the-fly dialect.
Right, based on the speaker's utterance.
Exactly.
Wow, that puts a lot of interpretive work on the listener. It's almost like cracking a code in real time.
Right.
So now, how do pragmatic twist accounts differ in their explanation?
So pragmatic twist accounts shift the focus from the inherent meaning of the words to the intentions of the speaker.
Okay.
So they argue that we use words with their standard literal meanings, but we intend to communicate something different from what we literally say. So metaphor becomes this form of indirect communication.
Okay.
It's a deliberate suggestion, where the speaker implicitly vouches for the truth of what they intend to convey, even if their words don't directly state it.
This sounds very much in line with Grice's work on conversational implicature,
Yeah.
where we infer meaning beyond the literal based on this assumption that the person we're talking to is trying to be cooperative and make sense.
Exactly. Grice's framework really provided the groundwork for this approach. Philosophers like Searle and Martinich explored how metaphor could be understood as a specific type of speaker, meaning. So when I say, you're the cream in my coffee,
Right.
I'm not literally claiming you're a dairy product.
Right.
You as the listener recognize this obvious falsehood. And assuming that I'm trying to communicate something relevant,
Right.
you infer that I intend to convey something else.
Right.
Perhaps that you're a delightful and essential part of my life. So the twist there happens not in the meaning of cream or coffee,
Right.
but in how you interpret my use of that sentence.
So the twist isn't in the semantic content of the words, but in how we pragmatically interpret the speaker's communicative goal behind those words.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to comparativist accounts. This seems to kind of resonate with that earlier historical view of metaphor as being rooted in comparison.
Yes. Comparativist accounts echoing that earlier emphasis on analogy essentially argue that a metaphor functions by implicitly stating that one thing is like another.
Okay.
So a sentence like, Juliet is the sun, is interpreted as meaning Juliet is like the sun. In certain relevant ways. The listener then has the task of identifying the nature and extent of this implied likeness based on the surrounding context and their general knowledge.
So they kind of see metaphor as this sort of shorthand simile.
Yeah.
Where the like,
Right.
or as is implied but not explicitly stated in the sentence.
That's the core idea. And modern proponents like Nowotny and Ortney have explored various facets of this. Robert Fogelin developed a particularly detailed version. He suggested that figurative speech involves speaking so as to stand corrected. So in the case of a metaphor, the correction involves recognizing the underlying comparison
Right.
and adjusting our canon of similarity to make sense of the statement.
Right.
So when we hear Juliet is the sun, we correct the literal absurdity
Right.
by understanding that the comparison is intended. And it's based on shared qualities like radiance
Yeah.
and centrality.
Right, and this helps explain why the direction of the metaphor matters too, right? So saying Margaret Thatcher is like a bulldozer conveys something different from a bulldozer is like Margaret Thatcher, because the prominent characteristics of the vehicle,
Right.
so the bulldozer or Margaret Thatcher, kind of shape our understanding of the tenor.
Exactly. And Fogelin actually draws on Tversky's work on the asymmetry of similarity judgments.
Huh.
So when we compare A to B, the distinctive features of B tend to be more influential in shaping how we perceive the similarity.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. All right, so finally we get to brute force accounts.
Right.
This sounds like it might offer a more direct, less mediated view.
Yeah, brute force accounts most famously associated with Donald Davidson take a pretty radical stance. They argue that in metaphor words retain their ordinary literal meanings, and speakers do not intend any special metaphorical meaning. Instead, a metaphorical utterance has what he called a framing effect on the listener. By juxtaposing the primary subject with the secondary subject, it prompts us to perceive the primary subject in a new light, to notice similarities, dissimilarities, associations that we might not have seen otherwise.
So it's not about a change in the meaning of the words
Right.
or a specific hidden intention on the part of the speaker, but about this direct impact that the utterance has on our perception and understanding.
Precisely. Now, Davidson famously wrote an essay titled What Metaphors Mean, and his answer was essentially, not much beyond their literal meaning.
Wow.
He suggested that metaphors don't have this separate paraphrasable meaning. Instead, they're like a nudge. They prompt us to make these connections.
Okay.
Think of it like a riddle.
Yeah.
The riddle itself has this literal phrasing, but it encourages us to think in a new way,
Right.
to find the answer. The metaphor encourages a new way of seeing its subject.
Right.
And he drew that famous analogy between metaphors and dreams.
Suggesting that their interpretation reveals as much about the interpreter as it does about the originator.
Right, so the metaphorical meaning, or the metaphorical truth that we talk about, for Davidson, those are the results of this understanding, not something inherent in the metaphor itself.
Exactly.
They arise from the framing effect, the way that the metaphor encourages us to look at things.
That's right. And Roger White offered a related perspective, suggesting that metaphor involves this interplay between two underlying literal sentences
Okay.
that prompt us to compare the situations that they describe.
Okay.
And Lepore and Stone also build on Davidson's ideas, focusing on how speakers and audiences kind of coordinate to create this effective metaphor.
It's pretty striking to see these four very different perspectives on something that we use so naturally and intuitively.
Right.
It really underscores the complexity of this phenomenon.
It really does.
Yep.
And the story doesn't end there. More recent developments in linguistics have offered even further insights into how metaphor works. Okay, so what are some of the more contemporary approaches to understanding metaphor?
So in contemporary linguistics, particularly in psycholinguistics, there's been a significant focus on how we actually process and understand metaphors in real time.
Okay.
So early studies sometimes tried to find evidence for pragmatic twist accounts by looking for processing delays in metaphors compared to literal language.
Okay.
However, later research has challenged those findings, suggesting that metaphorical interpretations can become active and compete with literal interpretations very early on in the comprehension process.
That seems to kind of align with the idea that some metaphors become so conventionalized
Right.
that we understand them almost instantly without needing to consciously engage in a pragmatic inference.
Exactly. And frameworks like Gentner's structure mapping theory and Glucksberg's categorization theory have gained a lot of prominence in psycholinguistics.
Okay.
So structure mapping focuses on how we align the relational structure between the tenor and the vehicle. While Glucksberg proposes that metaphors function by asserting that the tenor is a member of the superordinate category that's represented by the vehicle.
Right.
So these approaches are delving into the underlying cognitive mechanisms that enable our seemingly effortless grasp of metaphorical connections.
Right. And then, of course, you have that influential field of cognitive linguistics
Oh, yeah.
with thinkers like Lakoff and Tyson.
Right.
And their work seems to offer this really broad perspective on metaphor.
It does. Cognitive linguistics proposes this fundamentally different view, arguing that metaphor isn't just a matter of language. It's deeply ingrained in our conceptual system.
Right.
So they introduce this idea of conceptual metaphors, these pervasive, often unconscious ways of thinking about one kind of thing in terms of another.
Right.
Like the widely studied Love is a Journey. And these underlying conceptual metaphors, they argue, shape not only the linguistic metaphors that we use, but also our reasoning and understanding of abstract concepts. They also explore these really sophisticated models like mental spaces and blending, which describe how we create new meanings by integrating elements from different conceptual domains.
So for them, metaphor isn't just a superficial linguistic trick. It's a fundamental way in which we structure our thoughts and make sense of the world around us.
Precisely. And these cognitive approaches continue to be hugely influential and actively debated in contemporary linguistic theory.
Now, our source also briefly mentions the context wars.
Yeah.
What's the significance of this debate for understanding metaphor?
So the context wars refer to this broader ongoing debate in the philosophy of language about the extent to which context influences the meaning of our utterances.
Okay.
So literalists argue that sentence meaning is relatively stable, and context primarily serves to fix things like indexicals. Contextualists, on the other hand, contend that the meaning of an utterance is heavily dependent on the specific context of its use,
Okay.
arguing that pragmatic processes routinely enrich or even alter the literal meaning to arrive at what is actually communicated.
And so where does metaphor fit into this?
Well, metaphor is a prime battleground in the context wars. I mean, its interpretation is clearly highly context dependent.
Right.
So literalists might try to account for this by positing special metaphorical operators in the semantic structure, or by relying heavily on neo-Grecian pragmatic explanations to bridge the gap between literal meaning and figurative intent.
Right.
Contextualists, however, often see metaphor as this clear demonstration of how pragmatic processes can fundamentally transform literal meaning and context to yield the intended figurative meaning. So the debate really highlights that fundamental question: where's the boundary between what language literally means
Yeah.
and what we communicate using language
Yeah.
in these specific situations?
It sounds like this ongoing discussion about the role of context has really profound implications for how we understand the very nature of meaning making in metaphorical language.
Absolutely.
Now, finally, our source touches on the make-believe theory of metaphor.
Yeah,
This sounds like a really intriguing and perhaps unexpected approach.
it is.
So tell us more about this perspective.
So the make-believe theory, drawing on the work of thinkers like Turbane and significantly developed by Kendall Walton, proposes that understanding a metaphor involves engaging with or recognizing this implied game of pretense, or make-believe.
Okay.
So when Romeo declares Juliet is the sun, he's not asserting a literal identity.
Right.
He's not even just saying a similarity. He's inviting us to imagine that Juliet is the sun.
Okay.
And our understanding of the metaphor emerges from exploring what would be fictional within that imagined scenario.
Right.
So what properties would Juliet have in this game of make-believe,
Yeah.
given the known characteristics of the sun?
So the metaphor essentially sets up this temporary imaginative world, and we understand it by participating in that pretense, by figuring out the rules of this implied game.
Exactly. And the qualities that make Juliet like the sun are the ones that become, in a sense, fictional truths within the context of the metaphor.
Okay.
So this approach shifts the focus away from truth conditions or speaker intentions
Right.
and towards the imaginative engagement that the metaphor fosters in the listener or the reader.
Well, this has been a truly comprehensive exploration of metaphor. I mean, we've gone from these ancient rhetorical views
Yeah.
to contemporary cognitive and pragmatic theories.
Right.
And even this idea of metaphor as make-believe,
Yeah.
it really underscores just how multifaceted and fundamental this seemingly simple linguistic tool is.
It has. And we've seen these contrasting perspectives on
Right.
whether metaphor involves this special kind of semantic meaning, a particular kind of speaker intention, an underlying comparative structure, a direct framing effect on our perception, these deeply ingrained cognitive structures, the crucial role of context, or even an invitation to imaginative pretense.
Right. And it's clear that even within contemporary linguistics, there are these ongoing debates about how we process metaphors in the mind
Yeah.
and how they relate to our broader conceptual systems. Plus, that fundamental question of how much context shapes meaning continues to be the central point of discussion.
Absolutely. And the make-believe theory offers yet another compelling lens through which to analyze metaphor, highlighting the power of imagination in our understanding and use of figurative language.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, here's a final thought for you, our listener, particularly with your philosophical hat on. Given these incredibly diverse philosophical and linguistic perspectives, what does it truly mean to understand something metaphorically? How does this kind of understanding differ from literal comprehension? And how does it shape not only our communication, but also our very perception and conceptualization of the world? Is metaphor just this deviation from some idealized form of literal language? Or is it perhaps this fundamental and irreducible aspect of how we think and make sense of complex ideas? It's definitely something worth pondering long after our conversation ends. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.